third lecture in the BREAD-IGC social protection series. We are very grateful to have Paul Niehaus from UCSD and Tavneet Suri from MIT joining us today for a lecture on cash transfers. We're very grateful for their time and look forward to hearing what they have to share. Just a couple quick points of housekeeping. As with past lectures, we'd like to ask for any volunteers to become live participants where their video and mic is enabled, where you can ask questions later on in the Q&A session live. If you would like to be considered, please use the raise hand function. And after we have about 20 to 25, we'll disable that. All other questions we ask you to put in the Q&A box. And please, if you could just have questions relevant to this series in the Q&A box. Introductions are wonderful, but they're very hard to sift through when we're trying to answer as many questions as we can. And lastly, all past lectures and all current and future slides and recordings will be hosted on the IGC website in case you missed last lecture or might do so in the future. And we'll include that link in the chat. Without further ado, Tavneet and Paul, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Caleb. Great to be with all of you. I'm Paul. Tavneet is going to talk us through the second half of the slides. I'll get us through the first, and then we're looking forward to talking with all of you guys. Excited about the topic. I should say about 15 years or so ago, I was working on starting an NGO with some folks that does cash transfers. And we were debating whether or not to do an RCT of the first transfers that we rolled out. And my view at the time was that we should, because it was good for NGOs to do RCTs and tell donors what sort of impact they could expect to have. But that academically speaking, it would be a pretty fruitless project because there were already so many RCTs of cash transfers back in 2011. That paper became How Software Shapiro, which has 1,500 citations today. It was published in the QJE. And as you'll see, there has just been even more research on cash transfers since then. So, you probably should not trust my judgment about what sort of research on cash is likely to be academically successful based on my track record. But I do think that actually we'll have a lot to say, not just about things that may be academically interesting, but about things that would be practically useful, which is the sort of point of view that we tried to take in this chapter. And my experience is that often leads to things that are also academically and economically very interesting as well. So that will be our lens today. So just to elaborate on that point, in the paper, we provide a little bit more numerically, both on the reach of cash transfers and also on the evidence base on cash transfers, which is very, very large. So these numbers here come from during the pandemic when cash transfers were ramped up aggressively to try to provide social protection to people who were being affected by it during lockdowns and so forth. But even absent the pandemic, cash transfers today reach a very large number of people around the world. And to give you a little bit of context for that, I think there have been two drivers, among others, that have been significant. One is that the capacity to deliver cash transfers has increased dramatically. And so separately in the same handbook as this paper, Sandeep Suktankar, my co-author, has a chapter in which he describes the rollout of some of that infrastructure, digital payment systems, national ID systems, and so forth. So we're simply in a world today where it's much more feasible to make direct transfers to people, whereas in the past, it might have been that the only option was something like, give people free electricity if we want to do something to help them. Because we literally have wires to give people electricity where we did not have wires or pipes to give them money, and today we do. And so I think that's one important driver. But the second has been the evidence. And of course, it's very difficult to see the counterfactual world in which we hadn't done all of this research on the impact of cash transfers. But there are some case studies where I think if you dig in, there's a really strong case that, for example, the spread of conditional cash transfers after the early success and the early impact evaluations of Progressa in Mexico really were in large part because there was rigorous evidence showing that they were having positive impacts. And that was an important part of the story. So the evidence base has simply grown since then. This graph shows you that if anything, and it's sort of not, the way to read the most recent years are that we don't have a complete count there yet because the way we put together, the way this data set was assembled. But, if anything, since that, 2011, when I thought that we had a lot of evidence on cash transfers, the rate at which we're producing it has only accelerated. So we have an enormous amount of really high quality evidence. One way to think about a scenario like that is that, therefore, what we need to do now is to sort of think about how to generalize from it and abstract from it. And that's not what we're going to do in this project, in this paper, and what we're going to talk about today. But there are a couple of reviews that do that very nicely. A very recent one by Crosta et al., which is a meta-analysis of impact evaluations of cash transfers, looking at a whole range of different outcomes. So recommend that to you, and you'll have the slides and the link to that if you want. And then also some more niche reviews of impacts on specific outcomes like labor supply, for example, which is a common concern, right? That if we give people money, what if they work less, and so forth. What we're going to do instead today reflects some work that Tavneet and I did in the build-up to writing this paper, which was to go out and talk to some people who are consumers of the research we produce, people who are making policy decisions or involved in advising on policy decisions, and to ask them, sort of from your point of view, what are the important questions? And so we want to sort of approach the literature from that point of view. And I'd say that actually even more broadly than our specific topic today of cash transfers, I think that's a very important point for all of you that are starting research careers to take away. In my experience, one of the ways in which I see young researchers pick topics to work on is by looking for what you might call gaps in the literature, and then saying, I want to try to fill a gap. Right? That's one algorithm, if you will, for finding a research question. And I think if you were to look at this literature in that way, you would say, my gosh, it's enormous. Where are the gaps? I'm not really sure. Right? What I think is often more fruitful is to instead put yourself in the shoes of someone who had to make a decision. So, for example, Tavneet went and spoke to various people in Africa. They would ask her questions like, how do I decide how much of my budget to allocate to transfers as opposed to infrastructure? So, okay, that's a good, obvious public finance question. That's kind of an important thing. Those are both sort of core roles of the state, redistribution and social insurance on the one hand, and public good provision on the other. So how do we think in economics about getting the balance right? And then you'd say, well, I need to sort of have some way of thinking about the social value of each of those things. That might lead you towards a metric like marginal value of public funds or something like that. And you'd say, how do I sort of work through that, figure out, the relative value of each of these things, and therefore how much to spend on both of them. And that leads you to a somewhat different set of questions, which is in fact what we're going to focus on here. And so that's very consistently been my experience, that if you look at an area that might seem crowded or where it might seem like there's already been a lot done, but then say, well, what are the decisions we actually need to make? And what sort of economics do you need to be able to make those decisions well? You discover that in fact, there are some important things that we don't know yet. And so that's going to be our focus here today. So in particular, we're going to focus first on incidence. I'll talk through this part talking about sort of who benefits. And you can think of this as sort of two parts. There's sort of which households get the transfers. We're not going to deal with that here because there's a whole separate session on targeting of social protection to households. But we're going to focus on two things that are especially relevant, I think, for cash transfers and that are perhaps a bit less studied in the literature. One of them is who benefits within households, right? So by their very nature, if you give cash transfers to a household, they have a lot of flexibility in terms of determining not just what to buy with it, but like who benefits from it. And then second, we're going to talk about the incidence of sort of costs and benefits across households, or in other words, spillovers. And this is because, especially for cash transfers in recent years, there's been evidence that these effects are just absolutely first order in any sort of accounting of the total social impact of a transfer program. So I'll cover that. Our next topic is then going to be what we know and don't know about how to design transfers well, taking into account the fact that the people we're giving money to live in very imperfect financial markets. And so Tavneet is going to speak through this one. Short story, if we lived in a world of perfect markets, then transfers would just be about redistribution, and it would be a fairly simple problem to solve. But actually, sort of we know that people are facing credit constraints, missing insurance markets, all these other sorts of things. And so that raises all these interesting questions about sort of how to think about the value of a transfer in that world, and also the best way to design it to make that value as high as possible. So Tavneet will speak to that. And then last, Tavneet will also speak to the geography of the research on cash transfers. In some sense, this graph that I just showed you is going to turn out to be a little bit deceptive. And I'll let Tavneet explain why that is. But we think the geography of the research is also very important. Cool. So that's our plan. I'm going to dive in now on incidence. Imagine, as I just said, so imagine this policymaker trying to decide how to divide money, divide budget between transfer programs and infrastructure. Obviously, transfers would be more attractive the more we're able to reach the poorest members of society if we have redistributive preferences. And so what does that depend on? It depends on which households get them. And so, as I mentioned, we have a separate review on that you have access to. I should say, I think there's both a cross-sectional element to that, right? If you think that there are some households that are sort of chronically poorer or worse off than others, you'd like to target them. There's also a dynamic aspect to them, which is things are changing every year. People are experiencing health shocks, weather shocks, and so forth. And so there's also a separate question about how well we're doing at cushioning those. And I think that's actually sort of a relatively open one. I have not been able to find good numbers on very basic things like how do transfers that people receive from the state covary over time with shocks. So I think that's for all the talk of sort of safety nets and shock responsive safety nets and so forth. I think that's an open one. But we're going to focus here, as I said, on the allocation within households and then also on the consequences that this has for other households. Okay. So thinking about incidents within households, here's what we think we know. We're pretty confident that this matters, at least in some contexts. The challenge here, as I say in the bottom, is that it's very difficult to separately measure the consumption of different household members. If any of you have studied or thought about studying sort of household bargaining and intra-household allocation and so forth, you know that there are a handful of data sets that seem to do something like this. There are many papers that rely on sort of fairly simple measures like men's clothing versus women's clothing, sort of like one item of the consumption vector that we can sort of tease out and say that at least we can allocate to a specific household member. But if we wanted to know sort of comprehensively, like how much of the household consumption bundle is going to different members, and of course some of it also to public goods, that's hard, right? However, there are studies that to us are like pretty clear smoking guns, right? You have, for example, this evidence that there's a lot of household inequality in terms of measures of anthropometric measures of well-being. So most underweight women and undernourished children in sub-Saharan Africa live in households that aren't among the poorest, right? Which suggests a lot of intra-household inequality there. Or very clear evidence from Barcelos et al. Among other studies that some households invest more in male than in female children, right? So I think it's sort of, pretty well established that there is some of this out there. The questions then are like, what does that imply for how we design transfer programs, both in terms of which households to target and also which members within those households we want to designate as recipients and whether that matters. So think about the first point. If I tell you, hey, there's this household in which, the female head is disadvantaged relative to the male head or some of the male members, you could say, well, it's all the more important that we transfer resources to that household because it has this disadvantaged, maybe this undernourished member within it. Or you could say, sort of focusing on the price effect, if you will, there's no point transferring resources to that household because we can see that they divide them inequitably, and therefore we can assume that at the margin, they're also going to allocate additional transfers inequitably. And so we should actually deprioritize that household for targeting. I don't think we know the answer to which of those things it is. In terms of who to designate, this is sort of a funny topic because there is such strong consensus that the right thing to do is to transfer resources to female heads of households when possible, that there's actually relatively little evidence on how much that matters. And so we're going to walk through that and sort of essentially at the end come back to the same view that, in our view, this is actually a sensible thing to do. But I do think it's good to be aware that there's perhaps less on this or sort of a less clear picture on this than you might have assumed. Okay, so first, this is like a hard question to power for. We have some math in the paper where we walk through, let's say you think that there are heterogeneous treatment effects with respect to this parameter that are, a fifth as large as the main effect, right? So that's a pretty big difference, right? If sort of transfers to female heads have a 20% bigger impact on something than transfers to male heads, that would be a big difference. But like the power math on that is pretty brutal, right? You need an experiment that is 25 times bigger than the experiment that you needed to detect the overall average treatment effect of transfers per se. And so I think it's not surprising that in some of the studies out there, we're just not powered to detect meaningful differences, right? So we do have studies in which households were randomly varied. In some, the female head, and in some, the male head received the transfers. In some of these, we just don't see treatment effects that are significant, but we can't rule out some that are very meaningful. There are also studies, so for example, a very nice study of labeled cash transfers in Morocco by Ben Hassin et al., in which you do have exogenous, experimental variation in which household member gets the money, and we do see some effects, but the transfers are labeled in ways that may have influenced their use. So in this case, labeled as being intended for use in education and on kids. And so the fact that we don't see differences there between how men and women use the money might reflect the labels, right? And things might be different without the labels. So, which the labels by themselves, by the way, might be sort of an attractive policy option. But okay, so then we do have some studies in which you do see significant differences in the impacts between transfers given to male versus female heads of households. But here the picture is varied, right? So there are some in which You see bigger effects on nutritional outcomes when you have transfers to women. Actually, some, or at least one in which you have bigger effects on nutritional outcomes for kids when you see transfers to men, which is sort of very opposite the usual story that gets told. So I don't think there's actually a sort of like very simple story one can tell that like, yes, transfers to women clearly get used better. So I will defend my gender a little bit there, I suppose. But I think our view on this is that in some sense that's not necessary. That there's sort of a very strong a priori argument that if we see that at baseline some members of the household are disadvantaged relative to others, then purely on equity grounds, purely on distributional grounds, the right thing to do would be to prioritize them for transfers. Just in the same way that when we look at two households and see that one of them is deprived relative to another, we say we want to prioritize them for transfers, right? So I don't think you need to have shown sort of rigorous causal evidence of differential effects in order to make a very strong argument in favor of designating female heads or sort of any disadvantaged member within a household as the recipient. And indeed, if you look at what people themselves say about the experience of receiving transfers, especially women and especially people with other disabilities or disadvantages, describe that experience as being empowering, which I think is consistent with it. A related question is about how we actually give the money to people. And so here, the sort of exciting thing to consider is that instead of handing out cash to people, we're now increasingly using digital accounts. And those accounts have owners and signatories and people who have control over what happens with the money in them in a way that paper money does not. And it seems like this ought to matter. I have not seen a study of this in the context of a pure unconditional cash transfer program. We haven't. We have seen very similar problems. So for example, loan disbursement in Uganda. Emma Riley has a very nice paper, her job market paper, showing that it makes a difference whether you disperse loan payments to women in paper money or in digital accounts. Wage payment in India, for example, opening an account. The paper is called In Her Own Account, right, is the name of the paper. So opening an account in the woman's name makes a difference relative to putting wage payments in India's employment scheme into an account that's jointly controlled or controlled by the husband, right? So, a sort of very reasonable prior would be that this would matter in the context of social protection payments as well. I've recently worked on a paper, this is joint with Jeff Weaver and co-authors, where we looked at transfers like this into the accounts of pregnant and expecting mothers. And we see some really striking effects there. So these are households in which at baseline, women and children receive a disproportionately low share of household nutritional intake. We really did do the legwork, by the way, in this project to measure nutritional intake at the individual level as opposed to the household level. So we think we have unusually good measures of food consumption, and transfers into the accounts of women had a significant impact, not just on the level, but also on the share of household resources that they're consuming. So that's consistent with this, but that we don't have an arm in that study in which transfers go into an account controlled by the male head of household. One last note here is that all of these sort of studies and all of these transfer designs presume sort of the existence of a household. And the question is like, who within the household gets the transfer? You could go further and decouple transfer receipt from household membership entirely and just say adults are going to get transfers. And we have one study in the field right now in Kenya in which we look at a design like that. We are not comparing it to the design in which transfers are indexed to the household. But I think in terms of household bargaining implications and household sort of bargaining weight, that's a really important design to study and to learn more about. Cool. So the second incidence topic that I'm slated to cover is this one about general equilibrium. And so just to sort of get you thinking about it, I want to start with some fairly obvious observations about cash transfers. The first is that what you do when you get money is you use it to transact with somebody else. And so it's sort of very obvious, but it's also a little bit different than, say, an in-kind transfer, right? If someone gives you food, you might just consume the food, right, without transacting. You might transact, you might go out and resell it, right, in the secondary market, but you sort of might just consume it. With cash transfers, it's sort of almost definitional that you're going to go out, you're going to buy something, maybe you're going to put the money into a financial savings account. It's pretty uncommon, but there has to be some effect on the counterparty to that transaction, right, at a minimum. Then if you look at the behavioral impacts that we've seen, when you look just at the impacts on transfer recipients, there are a whole host of these that you would expect to have effects on prices or sort of other sorts of external effects, at least to some degree. So for example, I mentioned labor supply, which is a common question. This review sort of finds generally positive impacts of transfer receipt on labor supply. If we do that at a large scale, that has to have some effect on wages, things like this. So I think it's sort of intuitively obvious that there must be things like this going on. The second point I want to emphasize is that they may be very important even if the effect on any one neighbor is small. And so the reason I want to emphasize this is because you'll often hear in sort of econ presentations, yes, there probably are some spillover effects, but we're not worried about them because we only treated a very small share of the population of each village or something like that. And so that argument is valid insofar as what we want is the effect of treatment on the treated, right? What you're saying is essentially there might be some bias in that comparison to the untreated neighbors, but it's going to be small because it's spread out over so many of those neighbors. And we just treated a very small share of people. But if what you want is the total impact of the intervention, right, which includes the impact both on the treated and also on the untreated, then even a very small per neighbor effect could be big in the aggregate if you have a lot of neighbors, right? And so here you actually really do care about those things, even if you think that that the sort of per neighbor impact is small. Cool. So we classify in the paper the external effects into three buckets, and I'll walk through each of these in turn. The first are fiscal externalities, then pecuniary externalities, prices, and then other non-pecuniary externalities. Fiscal externalities, I think, are very much on people's radar these days, in part because of the sort of increasing popularity of, oh, actually, we have a missing link here. Sorry, I'll tell you about that one. So the popularity of the MVPF concept, right, sort of increased use of that and analysis. That one of the basic insights that comes out of that is that if you think about the impact, the social value of additional marginal spending, you want to think not just about the benefits it creates for the people who receive it, but also about any impacts that it might have on the government budget constraint, which are going to feed into the denominator of that measure of marginal value. So a simple example of that here might be that if people get money and they buy things with it, and some of those things are subject to a value-added tax, that's going to generate additional revenue. And so from the government's point of view, the true cost of the program is not the total amount of money they gave out, but like that amount minus the additional revenue they're getting back in value-added tax. This can have absolutely first-order welfare effects. As far as I know, we don't have a great analysis of this yet for cash transfers. Maybe one exception here, I think, for Brazil, but not a lot of analysis of this. We know that it can be first order in some settings. The tax paper here, I'll have to add the link afterwards, but there's a really nice paper using tax data for Rwanda showing that essentially when the government collected additional tax on imports, for every dollar of additional tax, import tax revenue they collected, they lost several dollars of domestic tax revenue because of the impact this had upstream in the supply chain. So not in the context of spending, that's on the tax side of public finance, but there is sort of good evidence that this can have first order effects that would like totally flip the way you would assess a policy. Cool. So those are fiscal externalities. Pecuniary externalities, as I said, wages could go up. We care a lot about how this affects the distribution of benefits. So for example, if wages go up, that is going to help workers. It's going to hurt employers. So that would change the redistributive analysis of the program. And non-pecuniary externalities, maybe a classic example would be schooling, right? So one of the reasons for which we subsidize schooling in many countries is because we think that there are external benefits that are really hard to assess and to price, but that matter a lot. If we have a better educated workforce, maybe we have more innovation, more entrepreneurship and job creation that benefits a lot of people, and that is not fully captured in the private returns to education, right? So we would want to capture things like that. All right, so this is a hard problem, and it's one that I've worked on a fair bit. Let me just briefly mention why and some places in which we made progress and some outstanding challenges. This picture comes from a study that I did in Western Kenya, where we randomized transfers at the village level and to some extent the sublocation level, and took a spatial approach to trying to measure the external effects this had. So in the picture here, we sort of picked an arbitrary location on the map, the blue dot here, and then highlighted in red the households near that dot that got treated and the households in black that did not. And so what we do in the paper is we try to understand, what's the effect not just of being treated yourself, but of being surrounded by a lot of people in a close geographic area who are treated as well. The reason this is a messy problem is because our whole paradigm for experimental program evaluation is usually based on sattva or some version of sattva, right? This assumption that there is a control group that is not affected by treatment to whom we can compare the treated people. In these sort of spatial settings, sometimes you'll hear people talk about the idea of there being a pure control group. And I think the reality is that in problems like this, let me break it to you, there is no pure control group, right? Everybody is affected to some degree and in some way. And so we do need alternative ways of thinking about it. Think about the way we model economies, right? We write down economic models in which things are very interconnected, right? And everything affects everything else. And so sattva doesn't hold in almost all of our general equilibrium models. So there's this tension between the way we write economic theory and the way we do experimental work. I do think that large-scale experiments like this can be informative. Karthik and I have a handbook chapter in which we write about that. If we allocate treatment in large clusters, like at the village or the sublocation level, that's helpful. It's let us learn some useful things. And the econometrics of how exactly to do that is still ongoing. I'm working on revising a paper right now that is exactly about this, about how do you interpret these large spatial experiments and estimate things, sort of policy relevant estimates in a consistent and rate efficient way. So you can learn a bit more about that if you're interested. So the takeaways I think here are just be aware that this is a difficult problem and be on the lookout for opportunities to conduct large scale experiments because they're particularly useful for this. So then going through those three categories, as I mentioned, in terms of fiscal externalities, like very little so far. One very nice paper, a natural experiment in Brazil, estimates that as Bolsa Familia, Brazil's national cash transfer program rolled out there, municipal tax revenue went up by a substantial amount, 2.5%. In the paper that I mentioned in Kenya that I was involved in, Michael Walker did an analysis of the impact that had on the very local public finance of very local government. Didn't find much of an effect there. My understanding of that context is the very local government here is primarily involved in things like conflict resolution and so forth, and not in a lot of sort of taxation and spending. So that may not be all that surprising. But basically very little so far. What we have mostly on the sort of tax side, don't know of good results on sort of crowd in or crowd out of participation in other social programs, which would be an important margin. So I think a lot more that could be done here. And if I were a policymaker thinking about how much to spend on transfers in my country, this for me would be like a first order question. Second, on prices. So a few studies look at this. In the one in Kenya that I mentioned before, we put a lot of money into these rural economies and estimate that consumer goods prices went up by a bit, but a fairly little bit. So about 10 to 20 basis points relative to 15% of GDP approximately flowing in. There's a nice study on this, two studies in Mexico that are nice. So Progressa, which is Mexico's famous cash transfer program, there's some evidence that prices didn't change on average, but that there was an effect on quantity discounts. And so I mentioned that mainly to highlight that this sort of idea of there being a fixed unit cost is probably wrong. And I think that in particular, wealthier households probably get better access to these quantity discounts than poorer households. And so I think this, in terms of sort of like welfare analysis and welfare economics, this is an understudied topic in general. So it shows up here. And then the other one, there's one more result as well from the Philippines that I think has a bit of this feel that in the most remote areas, you do get meaningful impacts of transfers on prices in areas where sort of supply chains are fairly monopolistic, right, where there's a lot of market power and not a lot of market penetration and density. And so I think that's important. That's been one of the arguments in India, for example, for a long time as to why it's important to have a food distribution system and not just a cash transfer distribution system, because I think that like food distributors have a lot of power, market power in rural areas, remote areas. And the sort of food network is effectively undercutting that to some extent, creating some effective competition. Okay, non-pecuniary externalities, so sort of things that we can't price. We have some good evidence on, from a few studies, sort of fairly substantial effects on aggregate economic activity. The first sort of really landmark study in this was from Mexico, from Progressa by Angelucci and DeGiorgi. And they just simply documented that a lot of the benefits of Progressa as it rolled out accrued to ineligible households, not just to the eligibles. So I think that sort of really got everybody's attention and put this question on the map. In our study in Kenya, we estimated a full multiplier, kind of looking at the entire economy, all aspects of it, and estimated that output increased by about $2.50 for every dollar of transfers received. So that's a very significant sort of factor you take into account if you wanted to put a marginal value of funds on a program like that. The Bolsa Familia paper in Brazil that I mentioned earlier also found pretty substantial increases in municipal level economic output. There's a lot of stuff that's not priced in here, right? So here we're just looking at sort of contemporary GDP. We're not looking at things like, what do we think are the social returns to education that might be different from the private returns, all these sorts of things. So I think there's a lot that's not in here that one could, in principle, look at. All right, to sum up the incidence bit, and then I want to hand over to Tabneet. I think sort of a couple of key takeaways I would underscore. One is that we think that transfers to disadvantaged households, members of households, look justifiable purely on a priori grounds, as I said, even though evidence of differential impacts is more limited than you might have expected, right, given their popularity. And I think that those tests for modality, like does it matter in what form you give the transfers to people, who controls the money, are really important. and a good direction to proceed. One thing I'd add is that I mentioned the power challenges of studies like this. One very complementary tool we have in our toolkit is to elicit preferences. So if I want to say, do transfers into an account controlled by Tavneet have a bigger impact on something than transfers into an account controlled by Paul, I need a really big RCT potentially to do that. If I just want to ask Tavneet, would you prefer to receive $1 yourself or $1.50 into an account that Paul controls? I can do that very quickly, very cheaply, very easily, and get a lot of precision on estimates like that. And those are very informative, I think, about the way household decision making works. So one thing we emphasize in the paper is that that's a complementary and potentially very useful way to learn faster and more cost efficiently about this topic than just looking at impacts. Cool. And then second point, we know that transfers can have this powerful stimulus effect on the local economy, that this can benefit other households, that it can generate some fiscal savings based on just a very few data points, right? I think I cited probably 4 or 5 papers in that section, and those are the 4 or 5 papers that we have. And so this is an area where any opportunity to evaluate additional large-scale rollouts, especially if we can combine it with administrative data on things like government revenue and government expenditure on other programs, those would be very high-value things for you to keep an eye out for as you go ahead. And last, I'll say, if any of you are technically inclined, I think there are definitely some interesting frontier issues in the econometrics of these large-scale spatial experiments that you could work on as well. Great. I'll stop there and hand over to you, Tavneet.
Great. I'm going to share screen. Oop, right at the end. Great. Can everybody see the screen? All good? I hope
All
so.
good.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thanks, Kev. Thanks, Paul. I'm going to switch gears a little from Paul now and talk a bit about financial constraints. And Paul already teed me up to do that. So we're thinking about a world in which, if there is no financial constraints, you can imagine that people can sort of move money around time pretty easily and across people pretty easily. So we're thinking about that world sometimes. But in general, we're not going to be in that world. We're going to be in a world where people are savings constrained or credit constrained. In this sort of world, it's very likely that a $1 transfer could have a bigger value if it enables the recipient to kind of get closer to the first best. So, we think in a world of financial constraints, we're living in a world of second best, where people have to optimize based on their constraints as much as they can. And in such a world, you could imagine that the $1 transfer could have a bigger impact. So, an example we give is when someone gets sick and that person is earning income and they can't work and they need treatment, it's going to have this compounding effect on their kids and their family. And could well-designed transfer programs help prevent that? If I could design a transfer program that sort of gets the person the treatment, gets them well, and gets them back to work, it could have more impact than just that $1. And ultimately, when we think about financial constraints, we're really thinking about a piece that's about the response to shocks. And so thinking about how well correlated transfers are with shocks becomes very salient to the discussion around financial constraint. So that's where I'm going to start off, is talking about kind of, how do we think about cash transfers and their role in kind of solving this problem of when there are shocks, can people deal with them? And in a world of financial constraints, that becomes key to kind of the impacts of the transfers. So I'm going to separate out that discussion into 2 pieces. One is aggregate shocks. Think of natural disasters or large level shocks, geographically concentrated shocks, versus what we call idiosyncratic shocks, which are shocks to the household itself. So, when there are big aggregate shocks, we often think of something that we refer to in the paper as shock responsive social protection. Governments will often introduce new transfers or broaden eligibility in response to these aggregate shocks. So when you think of a natural disaster, there's often a response from the government to try and deal or help people deal with that natural disaster. And as we go through, as Paul mentioned, both we're trying to give you a sense of what we know, but also kind of what are the open questions. And so much as we do see large scale transfer programs like this, think COVID, think of natural disasters, think of large food insecurity problems. We still don't know the bottom line performance of these efforts. Like, we don't know how much do transfers really help alleviate the impacts of these shocks. So what's the high frequency covariance between transfers and household income? We also haven't really studied the performance of reinsurance markets for these aggregate risks, right? There is a possibility to insure these aggregate risks, and have we thought carefully about that? Probably less than we would like. And then, we haven't spent enough time thinking about developing and testing transfers where the size is kind of linked to the prices of essential commodities. So when there's a natural disaster, you can think about it affecting prices quite dramatically. And so thinking about how we try to link the transfer size to sort of some version of the magnitude of the shock is also relevant. There's a nice paper by Lucy Gooden and others showing that, there are price effects of cash transfers, and how to implement cash transfers in that world becomes a little more nuanced than we might traditionally think. Moving on to idiosyncratic shocks, there's certainly a notion that some of these idiosyncratic shocks, when I say idiosyncratic shock, I think about, a shock to a particular household. Imagine someone in a household gets sick. This is not an aggregate shock. It's something faced by my household. And often, sort of people think that these might be better addressed with direct insurance programs. So think health insurance to deal with the health shocks, unemployment insurance to deal with unemployment. But ultimately, these sorts of insurance programs are pretty rare for the poor. In general, they're either too expensive if provided by the private sector and not enough of it provided by the public sector or accessible by the poor, even if it is provided by the public sector. So maybe cash transfers can help people deal with these idiosyncratic shocks as well. The reality is that, most of the cash transfers are targeted, as I mentioned, both in the Q&A and Paul mentioned earlier. There will be a lecture on targeting, so we're not going to cover targeting today, but it does use some measure of a proxy means test or a wealth measure or a poverty measure. And these can be very slow moving and not collected frequently enough to pick up shocks, right? And incomes are so volatile that using a slow moving target to try and deal with shocks to income might not be perfect. Okay, and so they might not be perfect at helping people deal with idiosyncratic risks, just because they're not targeted towards that. Which then begs the question, which was also a question in the chat, about whether we can target households' vulnerability to future shocks as opposed to their current situation. So instead of thinking about trying to target poor households, can you target people who you think might be vulnerable to these? There's been a lot less work on that, much harder to do. It's somewhat easier to do with some of the climate shocks than it would be health shocks, but those are going to be back in the world of probably aggregate shocks anyways. So there's much less work trying to figure out how do we think about who's sort of more susceptible or vulnerable to these shocks. And so certainly a big open question about how we do that. The other alternative would be to sort of try and provide households provide households insurance in lieu of some of the transfer. So basically, I'm giving you a cash transfer, but could you basically use some of that to purchase some insurance? And, on the literature insurance, we have one example here, Kesaburi and Willis, but this is true even in a bunch of rainfall insurance literature. The take-up of insurance at market rates tends to be very small. Much as we find insurance tends to have impacts on people, take-up has been quite low. And so giving households the option to take some of their cash transfer as insurance instead of the cash might also address that problem of low take-up of insurance. So another kind of place where there would be interesting work to be done is whether this would help not just kind of get cash transfers and social protection, but also address the take-up of insurance. Okay, so the other side of the coin on this is, okay, maybe it's really hard to figure out how to target vulnerability to shocks because they're kind of pretty random and, hard to predict ex ante. And when we do try to predict them, it's not so easy to do, especially the idiosyncratic shocks. So even if transfers are not indexed to shocks, one argument has been that maybe they'll reduce the likelihood that I need to, or they reduce the likelihood I'd need to forego food or things when the shock happens. Or they might just make me more resilient to the shock regardless, even if I'm not targeting sort of the occurrence of the shock directly. So, we don't know how we don't know a lot here. So another place where there's a lot of open questions, things like how much do transfers really target shock-prone households? We know little on that. How much do transfers affect consumption's variance over time or the covariance with shocks? And again, something we don't have a lot of evidence on. This is all about not how transfers affect the level of consumption. So as Paul mentioned, there's a whole lot of studies. He showed you the picture of how many studies. There's certainly lots of studies showing that cash transfers affect the level of consumption and improve the level of consumption. We're seeing this even in Paul and my work on UBI. This is not about how transfers affect the level of consumption. It's about the second moment. Okay, it's about how it affects the variance of consumption over time. Okay, so the one closely related study is showing is by Esfa and al. In 2017, showing that transfers do reduce the effect of weather shocks on food expenditure. So we do see a bit of improvement in resilience, but there's still a lot of work to be done to think about how whether they really do improve resilience by looking at these second moments of consumption. And I think that's really the test of whether they're helping sort of vulnerability to individual shocks. Okay, I'm going to sort of from there try and tackle another piece of this financial constraints is that could be endogenous risk-taking. So transfers themselves might affect the profile of risks that households face. So they might encourage people to change where they work, where they live, what they work in, what sectors they work in, whether they start a business or not, etc. And so if you are in a world where households are receiving transfers, there's a possibility that the transfers might actually make them take on more risk. So for example, in our UBI work with Paul and Abhijit and others, we do see that households take on more risk after receiving a transfer. We see an increase in the probability that households start businesses. But at the same time, during COVID, we see that, they are more heavily affected because they started businesses, right? When you take on more risk and start a business, when COVID got hit, given how it was dealt with, these businesses lost money. But at the same time, we saw that they were better able to deal with hunger. So even though they lost revenue in the businesses, they were better protected, on the hunger side by the transfers. So you can imagine that this question is not so trivial when households actually respond to the transfers by making their income stream more volatile. And one of the reasons they do that is they might feel the transfers are giving them some insurance and protection, and they might want to try and get, the higher returns from taking on that risk, and they feel like they can now take on that risk with the transfer in hand. So that's one piece of kind of the endogenous risk-taking piece that transfers could encourage. The second piece is it might even change the investments that get made in the first place, okay, which makes redistribution more attractive overall. So it may be the case that people who have less poor people might have sort of more untapped high return investments around. And we also know they probably have a higher marginal value to consumption. And so you could see them change the type of investments they make. And we do see this. There's quite a few studies showing the investment impacts of transfers and how they are investments. Okay. But given all this, there's something worth saying that the distinction between investment and savings is really blurry in practice. And there's no real good work trying to really separate these two things out. So there's an example, for example, imagine a household is not credit constrained, but is savings constrained. I don't have a good, high return savings or, a non-zero return savings option, but I'm not credit constrained. If I give you a transfer and then I see some low return investment go up, imagine buying a goat or something. I might use that as evidence of credit constraints, but it's not evidence of credit constraints. It might be just that's the best way for you to save is in a low return investment because you don't have savings opportunities. So, this line between savings and investments gets blurry. And so there's a bunch of work to be done to really think about how we tease apart effects on real investments, and what's credit constraints versus what's really savings constraints, but makes you think that it's a credit constraint. And thinking through what's the difference between investment and savings. The second piece of, that makes this endogenous risk sharing hard to see and tricky to see in the data is, even if households do have underexploited high return investments, you might be able to see that in consumption today anyways. And so do you really need to worry about kind of measuring all of those investment impacts? So an example is, if I get a transfer, I might actually reduce consumption today to make this high return investment. And so I'll see it in the consumption data anyways. Okay, and that consumption value might pick up the value of the investment regardless of the longer term effects. And then finally, it's worth mentioning that treatment effects on investments may vary independently from initial deprivation. And we see this in the work of Haushofer et al. They show basically if I predict deprivation using household covariates and the returns on and the treatment effects, you're going to see that even conditional on those deprivation measures, you're going to see varying treatment effects. So these things will vary, quite a bit. And so understanding this space better becomes even more important. Okay, related to trying to measure kind of how financial constraints matter is a piece of newer literature starting to think through the lumpiness of these transfers. So thinking about what's the sort of timing and structure of these transfers. And I'll talk about two pieces separately. One is the lumpiness and one is the timing. What do I mean by lumpiness? Well, a lot of social protection programs that are out there tend to be a payment every month, every few weeks, kind of regularized, looking like an income payment in some sort. But there is evidence showing that if you gave large one-time sums, these might have different effects, and you might think this is, a priori, you might think this would happen because of financial constraints. So the original cash transfer paper of Give Directly that Paul mentioned, this was a lumpy payment, a one-time large amount of money rather than a stream of payments. And they saw sort of big investments. And some of this comes from both needing a large amount of money to make the investment and the investment being lumpy itself, right? It has to be that you have a big investment to make, not something small that can be done quite easily. And so we do find evidence, and this is true in our universal basic income paper as well, that lumpy payments induce lumpy investments. And these lumpy investments generate larger overall or aggregate impacts. And we're seeing that in our recent work as well. So it's certainly the case that this signals the importance of financial constraints, very much, because it's not just that there's a lumpy payment, but there's also an investment that people that are trying to make that's big. We also see that, in recent work Paul has with others, when you give recipients a choice over whether they want a stream of regular payments or they want a big lumpy payment up front, they're going to overwhelmingly choose these lumpy payment schedules, okay? Which is kind of interesting to see. Probably, I think, Paul, the first one of a choice that we've seen, I think, explicitly trying to get at recipients' choices. This is also consistent with the popularity of institutions like ROSCAs. So rotating savings and credit associations allow you to take a stream of payments and convert it into a lump sum. Right, that's exactly what they're doing. I put in an amount every month, and 1 month I win the kind of pot, and I have a large sum of money. And we do see, ROSCAs are extremely popular. In Kenya, it's the most popular financial tool for a lot of households. And so this might also reflect this choice of wanting lump sums. In our universal basic income experiment, we're seeing that we offered a lump sum and a stream. And people that are getting the stream are investing it in ROSCAs to convert it into lump sums. And so we do see higher participation and lots more ROSCAs in the arm where we gave people streams. So much as we know that people like these lumpy transfers, we know very little about what the size of the lumps should be. And there's an inherent trade-off here, especially if you think of budget constraints on the parts of government. We could give small transfers, small lump sum transfers to very many, or large lump sum transfers to a few. To be honest, I don't think anybody's tested those together in one framework to understand the design part of this. Understanding how big these should be depends on a bunch of things. One, it depends on the distribution of the opportunities that people have, which we know very little about, right? Do I have an opportunity that needs $1,000, and does Paul have one that needs 2,000? Or do most people have one that's a little smaller? Okay, and we know very little about what sorts of opportunities are out there for poor households. Experimentally varying the transfer size is often low powered. It's really hard to pick up the difference between a $500 and $1,000 transfer in any real way, given the size of most experiments. And the other piece is, the return to an investment is quite different depending on the investment. So for example, I like this example that's in the paper, which is motorcycles versus coffee. If I give you a lumpy transfer and you decide to, Paul decides to buy a motorcycle, well, he's doing a motorcycle taxi business and he's going to get a ride tomorrow, the day after he picks up his motorcycle, right? Maybe the next day because he wants to ride around the village first himself. If I choose to invest in coffee, it's going to be 3 to 5 years before I see any return on that investment, right? If I plant a whole bunch of coffee trees. So different lumpy investments have different time profiles of returns depending on what we choose to do with it. And so thinking about how to measure those differences becomes really important. And with lumpy investments, this becomes even trickier to do because it really depends on the investment. And so lots more work needs to be done here, thinking about how we measure some of these lumpy investments and their returns. Okay. On timing, most social protection programs default to a regular payment schedule, like I said, just every month or every so often. If we had perfect financial markets and self-control and foresight, that doesn't matter, right? I could take a stream of payments and convert it into any sort of lump sum I wanted, anything I wanted. But that we know is not true. Financial markets are not perfect, right? So, and we know cash flow management is a major challenge for poor households, right? Transfers would be more useful if they arrive maybe when school fees are due, when you want to buy fertilizer, maybe during lean season. And so recipients do prefer irregular timing when asked. So an open question is, how do we measure systematically the demand for and the impacts of sort of contextually appropriate timing, or try to pair transfers with budgeting exercises of the household? And that's an open question. Okay, that's the financial constraints piece. I'm going to move on to where, as Paul mentioned, we started also thinking about where the research is done. For all of the stuff we've discussed, both the incident side and the financial constraint side, there's no reason that we expect any of these effects to be the same everywhere. We could build economic models to predict how these effects varied, and what we need to learn more. So it matters where future empirical research is done. Ideally, we'd like to allocate research to places where the research is not expensive, where we have weak priors or we don't know much, and where, the number of people benefiting from where there's more people that would benefit from better estimates. It's really hard to say where this is given the data. So what I'm going to show you is really imperfect because we don't know, it's not correlated with research costs. It's not what we know weak priors. Maybe it's the closest to weak priors. And maybe a little towards people will benefit, but again, it's not poverty rates, it's just population. So I'm going to show you, we took sort of the 3IE development evidence portal, it's about 315 studies in total, and we look at where it's distributed. So here's a map, and we compare it to population. So it's the number of studies per capita, basically. Kenya has 10 times as large a share of studies as it has a population in LMICs. Mexico is 8.5. India has 21% of LMIC population, but only close to 2% of studies. Okay, so this is showing you somewhat of the distribution. Like I said, it's not perfect because we'd also want to think about costs and really where would the impact be highest, but certainly starts to indicate where there would be where it would be useful to have more evidence. You know, we really do think future work will have more value if it's done in more diverse places. And there's still sizable opportunities on the table, right? India is thinking of replacing their in-kind food transfers with cash. There's still a dearth of evidence on this sort of question, and so a lot to be done there. There's little evidence on China's social protection scheme. It reaches 53 million people approximately, which is huge, and yet very little evidence on this. Of course, the question that arises in this context is, you know, what are the returns or the incentives to do this kind of research, given there's a lot of still open questions and open places. You know, one argument is that the professional returns are lower for replications than for clever new insights and new papers. I think, Paul, my take on this is no, a resounding no. And the reason is there are both contexts and concepts that are really understudied. You know, throughout this, we've tried to highlight the big open questions, which we feel like would be new and would really change our understanding of cash transfers. And there's still context that would make these answers, even the answers we think we know, quite different. So I think there's a lot of room to be innovative. And we should not expect results to replicate. That's certainly the case. And, you know, I think we are finding that even in small geographic regions, results don't necessarily replicate. So, you know, what we're suggesting is there's lots of places to study these things. There's lots of open questions. It's not a box ticking replication exercise, but actually the essence of the scientific method. So a lot to be done, lots of open questions, lots of places to study these. Let me end with action steps and then we can open up for questions. I think right on time. Caleb's going to be happy with us. If you have the ability to run experiments in this place, especially around recipient choice, and or in understudied countries, please reach out. Paul and I are happy to chat. The slides are posted on the IGC website, which we've listed there, and our emails are there if you'd like to talk more. Okay, I'll stop there and hand back to Caleb. Are you going to run the Q&A, or how would you like to do this?
Great, thanks so much. I think what might be good to start is if we open it up to any of the live participants. I see 2 hands here. And then if Paul and you want to have a think what you've seen in the chat and answer anything live, we can do that next. So I can just call on the first 2 I see. Farwa, would you ask your question, and then Lakshmi?
Thank you so much for this very useful session, especially on the cash transfers. And my question is regarding conditional and unconditional cash transfers, because conditional cash transfers are supposed to direct certain behavioral changes that we are expecting. Have you been going through the studies where we can see how effective those are, and how do they affect really the, the poverty dynamics, as well as, the kind of control that people have over their money? Because we have been discussing cash transfers overall, but not specifically the conditional and unconditional cash transfers and how they differ. Thanks.
Great.
I
Do
mean,
we
I-
have luck?
Yeah,
Do
Paul's
we want
taking
to
that
take
one.
multiple, or do we want to just answer one at a time?
I think one at a
Well-
time is a little easier.
One at a time for the sake of memory. Do you want to go, Tavneet?
I was just going to say there are a couple of papers, you know, that do run a horse race between conditional and unconditional. Certainly, they find different impacts of conditional and unconditional. But yes, you're right. Conditional targets usually health and education investments directly. On the long-term effects, I think there's less on the as long-term as Progressa, because Progressa is sort of one of the first conditional cash transfer programs that was really studied, I think, Paul, maybe, or rigorously studied. So we're not going to have with unconditional kind of the timeline of results that we have with Progressa. But certainly we see big long-term effects of Progressa. Did you want to add anything, Paul?
Agree. is there like a case for subsidizing things that are good and that people may not fully internalize the value of? Absolutely. And so you can think of conditional cash transfers as being a Pigouvian subsidy. And I think that makes a lot of sense in principle and will in practice in some cases. I think the other issue you want to think about, and there's a nice recent paper that looks at sort of the effect on incidence, which is that the people who choose to meet or are able to meet the conditions may often end up being better off than the people who don't. And so you give up something in terms of the progressivity of the impact when you do that. So there's a forthcoming, I think, AER Insights paper that sort of does a nice job of that in a few countries.
Yeah, one other just quick thing. You know, a lot of the papers, especially the more recent ones, are summarized on VoxDev. So this comparison of conditional and unconditional is actually on VoxDev. So please feel free to take a look there. And I think there's a lecture on conditional cash transfers coming as well, if I'm not wrong. I think Lakshmi, you were next, maybe.
Yes. Thank you for the great session. My question actually is more around labor supply. So on the one hand, research indicates that there is not necessarily a drop in labor supply. Anecdotally, I keep hearing from business owners that there is
I think we lost Lakshmi.
We lost Lakshmi, I think, right? Okay, maybe we'll go on to the next one and then come back to her when she's back. Shardul, do you want to go next?
Okay, thank you for your time. So my question is, in here, I'm working for the government of Assam here in India, and the government has provided 200,000 of in Indian rupees for enhancing rural entrepreneurship. So can we categorize this as a stimulus package or a grant? And if and what are the ways? My second part is, what are the ways we can assess the impact of this cash transfer, because it's unconditional and they are provided for different sectors for business on the rural sector.
Shardul, I think
you take that one.
Sure, yeah. The first question, sort of how would you categorize it? I think that how I wouldn't categorize it, in the sense that it may have impacts on both of those things, and it's good to understand both of them. In terms of how you speak about it, right? There's always a question of sort of how to present it to, to voters, taxpayers, other folks in policy circles, and so forth, which I think you'll know more about than I do in the context, right? In terms of what will resonate with people. To your second question on impact, are you sort of looking to design an evaluation of this thing? Are you sort of wondering what variables, what outcomes you look at? Or maybe could you just tell us a bit more about what you're trying to solve for?
So we are appointed for 2 years, but if I want to take this research forward for my PhD, so what are the ways we can assess it? Because I want to do my PhD on this topic only.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, so then you probably know this, so I'm sorry if I'm just repeating things, but I think the sort of core first thing is like, is there some way to generate a credible control group, right? There will be some people getting this money. Is there some way to generate a group that are not getting it that would provide a good counterfactual, a good idea? So, randomization is a very good way of doing that, where you say, if it's oversubscribed and we have to have a lottery because not everybody can get the money who would like to give it to, that's a great way to do it, because then you have some people who win the lottery, some people who lose. If you can't, but you have a ranking system where sort of everybody who scores above some threshold on some measure of deservedness, that's another good way, because you can compare the people who are just above and just below the threshold, things like that. So, variety of different tools that we have in our toolkit obviously depends on the sort of the political economy of your situation. But those are some things to think about.
Great. Maybe I can ask Lakshmi to come back in.
Yep, I was about to do the same thing.
Thank you, and sorry about that. Yes. So my question was related to the labor supply, and actually coming at it from the other side, have there been studies on working conditions in areas where, as in labor working conditions in areas where cash transfers have been undertaken, just to understand if that has actually changed a bit of the bargaining power and the power dynamics, between, of course, employers and employees. The reason I ask is all the studies seem to indicate that there is no drop off in labor supply. But anecdotally, what I hear from business owners is there is a shortage, or other people don't stay, right? And therefore, my mind goes to, maybe they stay because they don't like the working conditions, and now they can afford to at least have some basic living conditions that would not force them to take on jobs that they don't want to do.
Yeah, great question, Lakshmi. I don't think we have an answer to that. I don't think that's been looked at in working conditions. In my paper with Paul and UBI, we do find people switch sectors So that's why you might be hearing different things from firms and different things from the people themselves. Like we see people stop doing wage work and start their own businesses and put effort there. So then you'll see the firm saying, yes, there is a shortage because they're not working for a firm, but they started their own firm, right? And so we do see a switch in sectors. So these two might not be just working conditions. It could be just people are switching sectors. We do see that in our data. And that might provide a different picture depending on where you're looking, right? But I don't think we have anything on working conditions. Paul, am I missing one? Anything?
Yeah, I don't know of something that's looked at that. I think that wages will tend to be a good proxy for that, in the sense that if workers are able to command a higher wage, it implies that they should be able to command at least as good working conditions. But I don't have a strong view of sort of which of those things they would prioritize if their sort of market position improves. And as Tevdeep says, I haven't seen a study that measured it, so it's interesting.
Yeah, and Lakshmi just related, we see wages go up as a result, actually, because people are leaving the wage work. So you see wages actually go up.
Okay, maybe tying it back to the bargaining power that laborers have, that labor gets in these kind of markets.
Yeah.
Right? Thank you.
Wonderful. Paul, Tevdeep, are there any questions in the Q&A box that you guys want to touch on now?
It has been an avalanche. Great work, guys.
Yes.
It's been a struggle to keep up, and I apologize
I could
that we
not.
haven't got to all of them. So I guess as we do this, I'll try to keep going through some of those and flag any. But let's keep going with the live
Yeah,
questions.
maybe I can take on more of the live ones, and if you, Paul, pull out some of the Q&A, that would be great.
Okay, that sounds great. How about Tumo? Do you want to go? And then Abu Bakar, you'll be next. Haptamu, I think you're on mute.
Okay, may I speak?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. It is a nice presentation. I'm very clear on the presentation side, but I do have like a kind of a macro or a policy perspective question. This question is, I'm going to take myself in the three entity as a government or a policymaker, as an academia, and as a vulnerable group. So as a vulnerable group, I would like to take more social protection, coverages like either food or either cash or either insurance, whatever the case, I would like to get. But in the part of the government, I would like to invest this money on like road infrastructure, schools, whatever. As an academia, I would like to see the fair distribution of the country wealth to the poor, as well as some part of investment on the system, on like infrastructures, so as to bring a sustainable social protection system. So how to fill these gaps? Because in the normal scenario, if the economy is well, and you are giving sufficient money or cash, whatever, then the social be perfect. But we can't find this in reality. There's always a problem with inflation, price increase, whatever. So my summary of the question is how to fill this gap between the three entities, as a vulnerable, as a policymaker, and as an academic. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really hard question, Haptamu. I don't have an answer for you. I think in general, we know, we don't know a lot about the impacts of cash transfers combined with a bunch of other massive programs like infrastructure. We know a bit about some bundling, like with nutrition information, with other programs. We know something like the ultra poor programs, which are these big mass programs that do a bit of cash, a bit of food, a bit of all sorts of stuff all together. Again, I encourage you to go to VoxDev to look at those. But I think, the externalities piece Paul talked about is really important because it starts to give us these larger scale experiments that allow us to think about those compounding effects of cash transfers so that we could compare across programs, right? At the moment, we haven't been able to really do that. We haven't had the scale of experiments. The other piece that I think scaled experiments can do is interact with investments that governments are making and then test whether cash transfers might make those investments even more effective than they were before. To me, that's the core of the question, right? Are these trade-offs or are they not trade-offs for the government? And those trade-offs might matter differentially for vulnerable groups versus other. And I think we don't have enough evidence to really say that there is a trade-off. I think in general, most things we're seeing as cash transfers help you, create more effectiveness of existing programs. But again, there's very little work on this. So to me, this is big open questions. Can we understand whether they make this more effective? So if a government's building a whole bunch of roads, do the cash transfers mean I can now get to the market more easily? The effects of the roads get compounded by my ability to sort of exploit the use of the road being there better, right? I buy a motorcycle now instead of something else, and that's better for me, right? And I think those, unfortunately, those policy level questions, I think, need more evidence for us to be able to say all that much. Which means the academics are in a good position there, Havtamu, out of your three.
Yeah, because I'm a PhD student working on social
good.
protection.
Yeah.
So I was struggling to find out such kind of solutions. In Ethiopian case, we were dependent on social protection coverage since 1970, but still we are struggling on social protection coverage, which has only just 15%. So in the near future, it will be a big challenge for all of us, the government, the academia, and the vulnerabilities. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I think social protection will always have some role because of the shocks piece. We're never going to be perfect at that. And so my guess is there'll always be some role. Okay, I think Abu Bakar was next, so let me go to him.
Great. Thank you, Teganit and Paul. We had just one question on issues to do with multiplier effect. And having read Dennis' paper, I think most of the thing he was alluding to slack in the economy. So I just wanted to understand, is there any work on urban setup kind of to look at slack, or if there's a multiplier within the urban setup compared to a rural? Maybe I'm thinking of a Nairobi area compared to TI where you do the work.
Are you from Nairobi, Abu Bakar?
Yes.
It's my hometown too. So actually, I think that's one thing we should have mentioned, Paul, which is urban studies are much, much fewer. Especially in the African context, there's very few of them, Abu Bakar. I think there's a couple that happened during COVID around social protection, COVID related, which is slightly different than a regular one. Progresa, which is the Mexico one, did go into urban areas. It's now called Oportunidades. And so there is some work on that because they went from first rural areas and then into urban. But there's much less work on urban, definitely much less work on cash transfers and slack in the urban economy, because there's probably quite a bit of slack there too. So I think certainly open questions. I don't know of any paper doing urban cash transfers and slack. Paul, am I missing any?
That's mostly right. So in another response to another comment, I think I mentioned that Dennis Egger, who's my co-author on this first GE paper in Kenya, and some of the others have been doing a follow-up study looking at heterogeneity in that. And in addition, I think conducted some additional surveys, some of them in rural Kenya, some of them I believe in Nairobi as well, to try to get a sense of how measures of slack vary across enterprises in those different locations. And so you should definitely check that out. I'm pretty sure there's a draft of that up on Dennis's webpage. And I think generally speaking, their view is that there is like more slack in these sort of very low density sparse rural areas than in sort of high density urban ones.
While you're here, Paul, is there any question from the chat that you want to highlight for the whole group, or should we go ahead with the live questions?
Well, let's keep going with folks who are live, and I've been taking through some of the other ones as well. So
yeah, you're in the trenches. I just want to give you a chance to bring one up for the whole group. Prakash, I see your name up next. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi. Am I audible?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful presentation. Very informative. My question is, in India, cash transfers to poor households have expanded significantly over the past 5 years. I mean, although earlier also it was launched in many states. However, there is relatively limited evidence on their actual impact on household well-being. Is this lack of evidence due to shortcomings in program design, or weaknesses in implementation, or gaps in monitoring and evaluation systems? If you can share some some of your learnings from other countries?
Good question. I don't work in India, but Paul does. So maybe Paul needs to take that question. Paul, do you know why there's no evidence on the cash transfers in India or so little?
Yeah, I thought, I mean, there is actually one like good high quality large scale study because they just did it. So because we felt like this was an issue and we tried to put our money where our mouth was. And so that one's set in Jharkhand, and we look at maternal cash transfers through the ICDS system. And I mentioned very briefly there, impacts there are some interesting stuff. I think, first and foremost, in terms of intra-household equity, the impacts are quite striking. So sort of in the control group, moms are receiving a disproportionately low share of calories and other nutrients, and actually really frighteningly so, like during the period when they're breastfeeding, which is exactly when they need to be taking in like additional nutrients. And then in the treatment group, you see a sort of big shift there, not just in levels, but actually in shares that sort of proportionally consuming more household resources. So we thought that was exciting. We have some stuff in there about impacts on anthropometrics and sanitation. The picture's a little bit murky, but it seems like you do get some effects on kids' anthropometrics, but only in places where the sanitation environment is not awful. And that's sort of consistent with this idea that if you're like getting sick a lot, getting diarrhea, things like that, it sort of doesn't really matter how much you're taking in, because you're then going to lose a lot of the nutrients back out the other end. So please check that out. I think that's interesting. But in terms of like why we don't see more, I think there's this chicken and egg issue that like India doesn't have a lot of cash transfer programs. One reason for that has been that there's skepticism, and to Tavneet's last point, right? Skepticism about evidence from elsewhere. That sort of people will say like, until I see it here, I'm not convinced. But then without programs rolling out that researchers can study, we don't have easy opportunities to generate a lot of the evidence. And so, I think you need sort of an active civil society that's conducting the pilots and the early experiments in order to bridge that gap. And India hasn't had that. There was one sort of nice study by SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, that sort of did some of this, but was not quite at the scale or sort of as rigorous in terms of the statistical analysis as the stuff that I think you really need to convince people. So.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Oluwafikayo, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right, thank you. This is really amazing. Like the work you guys are doing is so interesting. This is a question I ask everyone who does research like this. That is, I think when your research affects oftentimes the most vulnerable and the poorest most times, there's a question you have to ask yourself about the ethics of your research and the sort of ethical implications of your findings. And I wonder if you guys have sort of considered that and what your considerations or what your conclusions you came to, if that makes sense.
What piece are you most worried about?
Oh, so it's not so much that I'm worried. It's more so I'm Nigerian. And there's a program now in the Nigerian context that is sort of trying to do this. And there are concerns about, for example, in a country where you have high corruption, right? Who gets prioritized? I think this ties to Habat's question. I'm not sure if I said that name correctly. I'm so sorry if I have. About, you have the politician, you have the poor people, you have the academics. There's so many interests, right? And there's only so much money to do anything. So what is I think it was Paul, I'm not sure who again said, it could be a lottery system, it could be a ranking system. And it's like, well, yes, you could try to have the most objective, most random system, but human beings are involved, right? And so At some point, there's an ethical conversation that needs to be had. And I guess my question is, what is that for you? And, I don't know if that makes sense, but I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question. I'm not sure I put it in the ethics bucket in a philosophical sense. Certainly, there's a big conversation about how best to do targeting. There's going to be a lecture on that. How do I think about what are the options to do targeting and who's even the right group, even aside from the politics of it all, right? Is it really the poorest? Is it the people who would benefit the most from this? Is it, and that conversation is certainly an important one, and one that is a lot of researchers are thinking about. The other is, do you get sort of resources funneled away, and how do you think of that process? And certainly there's researchers that have shown that, there was a very early food aid paper that showed food aid went to kind of the worst off villages, but not the worst off people. And so there was a role for the person distributing to decide that, and that might not go all the way we think it does, as you rightly said. You know, in general, a lot of aid has this sort of dilemma. Should I hand it out, you know, or should I pull it away because it's not reaching everybody it needs to reach? And, you know, ultimately, I think it does, as long as it does reach some share of people that really need it, and we think those impacts are important, then we tend to do it. You know, a lot of the studies, or at least the one Paul and I have been doing, is with an organization, Give Directly, that kind of is a nonprofit or an NGO and doesn't work with government. And so, you know, we do know that transfers are reaching people and we could see it in the digital data. So that's good. At least we're avoiding that piece. And then, you know, Paul and others have done work on trying to think about how we deal with the, you know, with sort of leakages. There's a lot of work now thinking more broadly in all programs, not just these sorts of programs, about how do we design programs or interventions that can reduce the leakages, or what you're calling corruption. And they're finding digital, you know, digitizing things does a bit of that, but not always. Because again, there's competing interests, and when do those competing interests come in and undo an intervention or undo the parts of an intervention that are supposed to do that? So I think as researchers, those questions are certainly on the table and people are asking them. And I think we have to put that together with what we're learning from cash transfers to get an overall picture for any particular place. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Oh, sorry for sort of having this overly philosophical lens. I literally just left. Before this, I was in a philosophy lecture, so that's where my brain.
No, it's
actually
totally
a
fine to
political
have that
economist.
lens.
So
I think the interesting work is kind of the work around digitization, which is not really about social protection necessarily. You know, Paul's work has been in the social protection space, but in other spaces, and saying, just in general for government programs, what does digitization do? And there's a whole bunch of papers. If you email me, I can send you some links, basically showing that in some cases it really helps and it reduces leakages and corruption and all of this stuff.
yeah.
But in some cases, if it's not designed well, the intermediaries can undo the entire thing. And then you don't get the benefits of digitization. And, you know, so thinking through the design piece becomes really, really important, if that's the piece we really want to grapple with.
Yeah, I think I guess because my work is I'm a political economist, so you know I look at the world through somebody has to win and somebody has to lose lens.
Correct.
And the core of my question, to actually ask it moving away from a philosophical frame, is, you know, how are we, who's winning and who's losing here, right? And again, this is not so much a question for you to like answer now. This is just the reflection.
Yeah.
You know, attending these lectures, these are the reflections I'm coming away with. It's like, clearly there are people winning, right? Like the beauty of your work is it's actually helping people. We can see that, that's tangible. But somewhere in that pipeline, I have to assume there are people losing, and I'm just curious what that means, right? So again, not something for you to answer now. It's just a reflection.
No, and I think just a quick answer to that is it depends on the program, and it depends on what the structure of the program is. If it's a government program, it's resources that you're maybe not putting elsewhere. It's resources taken away from other people, and those are the people losing, and we have to think about those. You know, the nice thing about the Give Directly side is we don't have to worry about that piece. But if we wanted to scale any of these programs or wanted governments to implement them, then those questions become salient. And there are some people studying those questions, so that we do understand how better to design so that the losers are not going to undo the core of the gains, right?
But also the main losers are taxpayers or someone else who paid for
Correct.
everything, right? So I mean, it's like,
Yeah, I was gonna, that's what I meant with governments. When governments implement, it's
right.
either the implementers or the taxpayers. And often we think of the taxpayers being on the higher income side, you know, and putting taxes into these programs.
Thanks so much for your answers there. Yuazan, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I think so. My first question is related to the GE paper, and I was just wondering, given the variety of outcomes that those researchers and studies have assessed on cash transfers, I was wondering if there's like some sort of a unified welfare analysis to kind of generalize across those outcomes and have like a cost benefit, almost like a cost benefit ratio, but across all those outcomes. And you mentioned in the lecture, like for some outcomes like education, those are hard to price. But I was wondering, assuming that the cash transfers increases people's education and possibly their future income, they could be increasing the local government's tax revenues as well. So I was just wondering if there's a way or a method from the economic literature that could have like a calculation of benefits across all those outcomes and channels, so people could compare like policies of cash transfers across the policy options or policy categories.
So Paul, I think this is yours. It's the GE paper. I think
Yeah,
they're basically using GDP, right?
The core point of that paper is to estimate a multiplier. We talk in the paper about how that's different from welfare, and sort of what the wedges are. The MVPF guys have, I think they have published this. I don't know if they have yet, but they've been calculating a marginal value of public funds based on that paper. And so I will see if I can track that down and share the link to you. That's, there's sort of different, there's some debate, active debate in public finance about sort of what are the best metrics to use for sort of social value relative to social cost of different policies. But that's the one that I think has gained a lot of momentum in recent years. And so I will see if I can find that for you. I know that Nate Hendren reached out and asked for some help putting that together.
I think we have time for one more question, Caleb, right?
Yeah, I agree. Ami, would you care to share your question?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, professors, for your presentation and for sharing with us this very interesting body of work. My question is specifically on your experience working with policymakers at a country level. And in your experience, have you seen a particular approach working well when it comes to presenting, this evidence and insights from various studies to policymakers and how they receive it? Or do you think that different countries have taken different path when it comes to taking these critical decisions, especially on the design of the programs? Certain countries, in your opinion, if they do well, if you could kind of share which country those are and what is it that makes them different? And specifically in my experience, based out of India, I've seen that most of the decisions are, driven by the politics of the time, and oftentimes are taken by decision makers who are in an emotional state. So it could be something like the cash transfers that were decided overnight at the time of COVID, specifically India, and a lot of these conditions were actually removed, and those were done essentially to kind of make sure that these support reach the people in time, but they also kind of broke some of the basic rules around social protection that have been built in India over time. So we don't see like a minimum set of standards that are there. I mean, every program is unique. Every program is kind of influenced by the politics. So would love to know your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
I think mine and Paul's experiences are going to be quite different. I think there's
I'll share a new story.
I think with policymakers, we certainly do interact with them a lot. We get a lot of positive feedback. Whether they implement or not is a function of what the politics are. But the idea is if we keep doing this, you'll be there at the right time, at the right place for this, where the evidence starts to matter and how you design these things, how they implement them. So I do think that's true. I think we've had success, actually. South Africa might be one of them where evidence has mattered. I do think, the thing we said about where is really important, because a lot of policymakers want evidence that's local. And that I think we do see, and we also have a hard time saying just because it worked in Kenya, it's going to work in India, right? I'm not sure we would all want to make that leap either ourselves. So, I think that's certainly another piece is there are certainly a lot of places where we still just don't have any evidence, and it's not clear for the particular context being different enough that we would generalize. Paul, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I'd underscore that idea that like policy influence is relational, and it's not, sort of writing a paper and then writing an accessible policy brief that goes on the website so that people can understand what your paper says. It's like taking time to build relationships with people, understand what they see as the big issues and the challenges, doing work that is relevant to what they care about, and then being there when they have a question. And I think you see that in the South Africa example that Tavneet spoke, where Kate Orkin and her team spent a lot of time building a relationship with the government and helping them to interpret evidence from other places that led to the decision to kind of scale up transfers massively during the pandemic. I'll share one more example from my work in India, which I think gets to your point about sort of both the politics and the evidence of it, which was that when we were doing an evaluation in Andhra Pradesh of biometric ID as they were rolling it out there, the chief minister was getting a lot of pushback from people saying, this is depriving legitimate beneficiaries of their benefits. It's a problem. We need to stop it. This is going to cause us all sorts of problems. And actually, that was mostly coming from sort of people, middlemen, who are having their rents cut out. There are some examples of people that were having issues, but say that they love to tell those stories, right? Because it's in their interest to tell those stories. And so we had evidence of the impact that the program was having on poverty, and also simple evidence of what people wanted, right? So like 90% of the people we asked said they preferred the new system to the old system. And so when the chief minister was deciding whether to keep it or scrap it, we were able to share that. He kept it, who knows what would have happened in the counterfactual world if we had not been there, we can't say. But I think that's a good example where we had like been with them in the trenches through the entire rollout, designing the evaluation and updating them on a monthly basis about what we were seeing from the field data. And so, they wanted to hear like what we were seeing and take that into account along with the politics of the situation in deciding what to do. So, and there's an even bigger politics, which is, somebody said to us, like, what's interesting about that project is not so much that biometric authentication worked, but that they chose to let it work. That they decided that the political economy of the state was such that they wanted to clean up social protection as opposed to other things. So, that's there as well. But so, we have a role to play. I think we can be more strategic in thinking about the role that we play in the ecosystem as opposed to just the very simplistic, like, more knowledge is always better view of the world. But, can it matter? Absolutely.
I think that's a good place to stop, Caleb.
Thank you.
I think that's wonderful. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Tavneet. This has been a wonderful
everyone.
lecture. Please, everyone, do join next week. We're going to have a lecture on the form of transfers, cash, in-kind vouchers, from Lucy Gaden and Monica Single. We're excited to see you there. And again, big thanks to our lecturers this week. Have a great day, and hope to see you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.